Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and on this channel I upload all sorts of different types of videos relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you know whenever I upload a new video. And for today's case, we're back discussing a solved case, and it's a case often referred to as the 1986 Auburn cyanide murders. So obviously that gives you a little insight into the case. Before we get started discussing the details of the case, I just want to zoom through my normal disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos. Just let you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the 1986 Auburn cyanide murders. So in order to begin this case, I just want to do a little bit of background information into a woman named Stella Maudine Nicol. Stella Maudine Nicol was born Stella Maudine Stevenson on the 7th of August in the year of 1943 in a place called Colton in Oregon. So Stella grew up with her parents, Alva, Georgia, Joe and George Stevenson, and the family didn't really live a particularly glamorous life. They didn't really have a lot of money while Stella was growing up, and when she was 16 years old, she actually fell pregnant with her first daughter, who she called Cynthia Hamilton. Not long after her first daughter was born, Stella had moved to Southern California, where she got married and gave birth to her second daughter. And at this point in her life, Stella started to get herself in some trouble with the law. In particular, in 1968, when she was just 25 years old, she was convicted on a fraud charge, following which she served 6 months in jail. In the year after this occurred, it was reported that Stella was convicted following an incident where she'd used a curtain rod to beat her eldest daughter, and then in 1971 she was convicted on a forgery charge. So she didn't receive any jail time for the abuse charge, but instead was ordered to attend regular counselling sessions. In 1974, Stella had met a man named Bruce Nicol. Bruce worked as a heavy equipment operator and was known to have a particularly bad drinking problem. The pair had hit it off immediately and they got married in the year of 1976, and their marriage ended up lasting for a total of 12 years. During their relationship, Bruce did eventually check into rehab and quit drinking as a result, and in a lot of the reports that I read, it stated that Bruce's sobriety actually ended up being the root of a lot of their issues in their relationship, as it seems that Stella resented his choice to give up drinking. And then on June the 5th, 1986, 52-year-old Bruce Nicol had left work early and arrived in the couple's home in Auburn, Washington. He'd reported having suffered from quite a severe headache, and he headed home where, according to his wife, he had taken a total of 4 capsules of the extra strength Excedrin branded painkiller from a bottle that was found inside their home. And just minutes after he had ingested these capsules, Bruce had collapsed. He was taken to the Harborview Medical Center, where he very quickly passed away after a failed attempt at reviving him. And the initial assumption had been that his death had been the result of natural causes, once the medical staff had learned of his previous complaints of a severe headache, and then the physicians present soon stated that the likely cause was emphysema. And Bruce Nicol's death was not revisited until there was another reported death under similar circumstances that occurred less than a week afterwards. On the 11th of June that same year, 40-year-old bank manager Susan Snow had woken up in the morning and found that she was suffering from a headache. She had taken 2 capsules from a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin branded painkillers that were inside her home, followed by her husband, a man named Paul Webking, having taken 2 capsules from the exact same bottle to ease the pain of his arthritis before leaving for work. At 6:30 a.m, their 15-year-old daughter had awoken to find Susan Snow on the floor of their bathroom with a faint pulse but unresponsive. She had called for help, and the paramedics had soon arrived to take her to the same hospital where Bruce Nicol had passed away, but she too had never come to and eventually passed away. And an autopsy was carried out on Susan Snow's remains, and the assistant medical examiner had actually been the one to make the unusual discovery. She noticed that there was a faint smell of bitter almonds radiating from the remains, a smell that is commonly noted when an individual has ingested cyanide. And when this finding was noted, the examiners had carried out the required test on Susan Snow's remains, and it was confirmed that she had actually died of acute cyanide poisoning. And as a result of this, local authorities had headed to her family's home in search of the Excedrin painkillers that she and her husband had taken prior to her passing. And when the remaining capsules inside the bottle were tested, some of them were found to have contained toxic amounts of cyanide. And the news of the unusual and unsettling death spread pretty quickly, with many of Washington's residents searching their own households for the same branded bottle of painkillers. A bottle was found in a grocery store in Kent in Washington, not far from Auburn, that had been from the same distribution lot as the known tainted bottle. And this bottle too had also been found to have contained capsules that were laced with cyanide. And the manufacturers of these painkillers, a company called Bristol Myers, had then publicly recalled all of the extra strength Excedrin products in the area of Seattle in Washington, and a reward of $300,000 was posted for the person who could capture the individual that was responsible for tainting these products. And because of the huge amount of public attention that the poisoning had gained, Stella Nickell had stepped forward into the public eye on June the 19th and told the authorities that her husband had died recently under very similar circumstances after having taken 2 capsules from an extra strength Excedrin brand bottle, and this bottle, she stated, had shared the same lot number as the one found inside Susan Snow's home. So this new piece of information had prompted a re-examination of Bruce Nichols' remains, and the FDA had confirmed that there was evidence of cyanide in the remains, as well as 2 bottles of Excedrin that Stella Nickell had handed over to them, claiming that she had found them inside her home. And because of the nature of the incident, with 2 victims being from seemingly unrelated households and both of them having taken capsules from bottles made in the same distribution lot, the assumption had been that those responsible for these deaths had been the manufacturers of Excedrin. In response, both Stella Nickell and Paul Webking, who was Susan Snow's husband, had both filed wrongful death lawsuits against Bristol Myers, the manufacturers of the pills, and it was announced that the plant in Morrisville, North Carolina, where that particular lot of Excedrin products was packaged, was to be inspected thoroughly. But this inspection found no sign of cyanide in any other bottles in lot 5H012, nor in the Morrisville plant itself, and so it remained unknown as to how these particular bottles in Washington had come to be laced with cyanide. And so as a result of this, in the same month, Bristol Myers had alerted the public that they were recalling all Excedrin capsules in the US and warning anyone who may have them already in their household. 2 days after this announcement, they also announced that they were recalling all of their non-prescription capsule products in their search for answers. Less than a week later, it was discovered that a bottle of extra strength Anacin 3 was contaminated with cyanide, and this bottle was found in the exact same store that Susan Snow had purchased her contaminated bottle from. On June the 27th, the state of Washington had introduced a 90-day ban on the sale of all non-prescription medications in a capsule form. As the case had become increasingly publicised, it was announced that the known contaminated capsules were to be tested further in an FBI crime lab. And this testing had discovered that the cyanide-laced capsules didn't just contain cyanide, there were also traces of an unknown green substance, something which was later determined to be an algicide. But this particular product was targeted for the use on home aquariums and was sold by a brand named the Algae Destroyer, and this discovery appears to raise even more questions than before. By this point, it seemed pretty clear to the investigators that the contamination had not occurred during the manufacturing or the packing stages of the process, and so their attention turned to the stages towards the end of the line, in particular the people who may have had some form of contact with the products whilst in the selling stage. Now, for a bit of context, I just thought I'd chuck in here a little bit, briefly, how the actual Excedrin bottles were packaged at the time, so you can sort of understand how someone would go about lacing the capsules. So at the time, they were sold in plastic bottles with the top sealed by a layer of foil, not uncommon to what you find nowadays, and there was a lid on top, and then that was held in place with plastic wrap. So So it wouldn't be entirely impossible for someone to have replaced the capsules with contaminated capsules because they could have just resealed the bottles themselves. But this knowledge did seem to raise more questions, although like I said, it wouldn't be impossible for someone to tamper with them and then just reseal the bottles themselves. It was around this same time in the investigation that the investigators had returned to Stella Nichol and Paul Webking in their investigations, and the pair were asked to take part in polygraph tests. Paul Webking had agreed to take part in one, although following doing so he had been rather outspoken with his complaints regarding how he was treated by the investigators at the time, as well as him being particularly unhappy with how much negative press he was receiving since the incident was becoming so widely publicised. Stella Nichol, however, had flat out refused to take a polygraph test. The Stella Nichol's lawyer, who she had hired for the wrongful death lawsuit, had been the one that she had asked to speak on her behalf to the reporters in order for her to explain why she declined participation in these polygraph tests, with her citing that it was because she was too shaken up by the entire incident to be able to sit through a test. But very quickly, Stella Nichol appeared to just raise some eyebrows during the course of the investigation. It was known at this point in the investigation that a total of 5 contaminated Excedrin bottles had been found over the entire country following the announced countrywide recall, and these bottles were all found pretty much in different locations and at different times. Investigators came to note just how unusual and unlikely it was that Stella Nichol had been in the possession of 2 of these bottles, which she had handed over at the start of the investigation, when the chances of that just were extremely slim. And when this suspicion had started to point in the direction of Stella Nichol, more and more evidence started to pile up against her. It was discovered that Stella Nichol had been entitled to roughly $76,000 through her husband's life insurance policy, and she would have access to another $100,000 if his death was ruled as accidental. With the FBI's help, it was also determined that a number of her husband's signatures on the papers of this life insurance policy were actually forged. This, combined with the potential payout of the wrongful death lawsuit that she was in the process in at the time, would mean that Stella Nichol had the potential to become a rather wealthy woman. It was also found that, according to responding doctors in the presence of Stella during her husband's final few hours, she was very quick to dispute their initial ruling that his death was the result of natural causes. With a bit of digging, investigators were soon able to confirm that they had evidence that Stella Nichol had been purchasing the same algae destroyer product found in cyanide-laced capsules from a local fish store. It was believed that the algicide being present in the capsules had been entirely accidental, that she had used the same surface or container, and that she hadn't cleaned it in between uses, and that's just how the traces ended up in the capsules. In November of 1986, Stella Nichol ended up agreeing to take part in a polygraph test, which she ultimately failed. With all the evidence seemingly piling up against her, the suspicions of the investigators were seemingly unwavering, but they still lacked the solid evidence that they would need to prove her involvement. More specifically, they hadn't found any evidence to prove that Stella Nichol had purchased or had ever been in the possession of any form of cyanide, and without this they wouldn't have a strong enough case to convict her in court. And little else happened in the investigation until January of the following year, when the investigators at the local police department had received an unexpected visitor. Cynthia Hamilton, who was Stella Nichol's oldest daughter, had gone in search of the investigators, believing that she had information that could help them in their search of the guilty party. She informed the officers that not long before Bruce's death, Stella had told her eldest daughter on multiple occasions that she wanted her husband dead. She told Cynthia that since becoming sober, he was a boring man who would much rather spend all of his time at home and watching television rather than taking her out to bars like they used to do. And according to Cynthia, Stella had gone as far as to say that she had made previous attempts on multiple occasions to poison Bruce with foxglove rather than cyanide, and when this attempt with the foxglove had failed, she'd then taken herself to the local library to do some research on some more lethal poisoning methods. There was also allegedly a conversation that had occurred between Cynthia and her mother where Stella had told her all of the things that her and her daughter could do together with the money from the life insurance policy payout. When the investigators had attempted to follow up on these claims to confirm Cynthia's story, they came across the record found at the AUBURN Public Library, which did show that Stella had both checked into the building and checked out with multiple books around poisonings. There was one book in particular called Deadly Harvest that was listed as being overdue, meaning that Stella Nichol was likely still in the possession of it. And to further build on their evidence, the FBI tested the pages of all of the books that she was known to have checked out and found Stella Nichol's fingerprints specifically on the pages that were dedicated to cyanide. And by mid-1987, it was confirmed that Stella Nichol was the prime suspect in the case of the poisonings. On the 9th of December that same year, Stella Nichol was indicted by a federal grand jury on a number of charges, including 5 counts of product tampering relating to the known contaminated Excedrin bottles, 2 of which of these incidents leading to the deaths of Susan Snow and Bruce Nichol. She was arrested that same day, and then the trial then didn't begin until April of 1988. At the end of the trial, the jury announced that Stella Nichol was found guilty on all charges following their 5-day deliberation period. Nichol's legal team had attempted to motion a mistrial on the grounds of jury tampering and misconduct, but due to a lack of evidence to support this, their attempt was denied, and she was ultimately sentenced to 2 90-year sentences for the deaths of Susan Snow and Bruce Nichol, and 3 10-year sentences for the product tampering charges. She was ordered to serve these terms concurrently, and she also had to pay a fine and forfeit any of her assets to the families of the 2 victims. Following the trial, Stella Nichol publicly maintained her innocence and continued to attempt to appeal her sentencing on the grounds of these claims of jury tampering and misconduct, but these attempts were ultimately refused. In 2001, the Innocence Project had requested a new trial for Stella Nichol based on the claims that someone believed there was evidence that was being withheld by the FBI that may have altered the outcome of the trial, but this appeal for a new trial was denied. Nichol has also since claimed that her daughter Cynthia had lied about her involvement in all these alleged conversations, and she had done so in order to ensure that she would be the only one to receive the life insurance and the lawsuit payouts. And not only this, she also claimed that she wanted to get her hands on the $300,000 reward that was offered up for whoever caught the guilty party by the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And Cynthia Hamilton did eventually receive around $250,000 of that reward money, and Stella had since then shared her belief that the witnesses in the trial and some of the members of the jury had been promised payment by Cynthia in exchange for the guilty verdict, but like I said, there was no evidence to support these claims. In terms of the wider effects of this case, it's worth mentioning the case of the Tylenol murders in 1982. I'll link some fantastic videos down below that cover this case in detail, but just very briefly, just so you understand sort of the wider effects that these cases have had. So in brief overview of the Tylenol murders, a total of 7 people had died in the space of less than a week after ingesting extra strength Tylenol brand capsules. And just as in this case, it was known that the capsules had been tampered with following the manufacturing stage, and it was determined that it had likely occurred when someone had purchased a number of bottles from a number of Chicago-based stores. And following that case occurring, FDA regulations were introduced that declared it a federal crime rather than a state crime to tamper with products. And because of this, Stella Nichol's crime was eligible to be prosecuted as a federal product tampering charge in addition to a state murder charge. But in this incident, she was not convicted on a murder charge, but rather on product tampering charges that caused death. The question of where she managed to get her hands on this cyanide remains unanswered from what I can gather, and there are still some people out there who appear to believe that there is actually a chance that Stella Nichol was wrongly convicted, especially considering her consistently declaring her innocence. From what I can gather, Stella Nichol wasn't eligible for parole until 2018, but I believe she was denied in 2017 and remains in custody, although there isn't a lot of information or updates. But yes, that is where I'm going to end today's video. As always, please do leave your thoughts down below, and don't forget to leave any case suggestions that you want me to do. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.